Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that never occurs to anyone until they're already lying awake at 2 in the morning. What, exactly, did a pirate eat for 6 straight months at sea, when the nearest grocery store was several centuries away from being invented? If you're the kind of person who finds comfort in the mundane, unglamorous logistics of history, the food, the boredom, the paperwork of piracy rather than the sword fights, then stick around, because tonight is entirely for you. As always, a like and a subscribe are genuinely appreciated, but only if you actually enjoy what happens here. This isn't a channel that needs it. I'd rather you fall asleep happy than feel obligated. While we get started, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I like knowing that somewhere out there, in a dozen different time zones, there's a small quiet gathering of people deciding that biscuits full of insects are the ideal bedtime story. I'll be reading those later, half asleep myself. Probably. Let's dim the lights now. Maybe put a fan on, somewhere out of sight, just for that low, steady hum. Get comfortable, you won't need to move for a while. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just signed on to a ship. Maybe you volunteered, maybe you were convinced in the particular way that pirate crews sometimes convinced people, and maybe, if you were unlucky in a specific and darkly funny way, you were simply on the wrong merchant vessel when it got captured, and now here you are, recalculating your entire life plan. Either way, the ship is set to be gone for 6 months, and before it goes anywhere, someone has to fill its belly with enough food to keep 60, 80, maybe 150 grown men alive, working, and ideally not mutinying over the quality of the soup. That someone, this week, is you. Picture this. It's the morning before departure. The dock is a mess of barrels, sacks, crates and men shouting numbers at each other that don't seem to add up no matter how many times they're recalculated. And somewhere in the middle of it, a quartermaster with a ledger and the patience of a saint is trying to make sure the ship doesn't starve somewhere around month 4. This is the least romantic part of pirate life, and also, unfortunately, the part that determines whether you survive the other, more romantic parts. The first thing you learn is that a 6-month voyage isn't provisioned by guesswork. There's a rough formula sailors of the era worked from: so many pounds of bread, so many pounds of meat, so many gallons of water and beer per man per week. And the hold gets packed according to that math, multiplied out across the whole crew and the whole voyage, with a little extra tucked in because someone always overeats, something always spoils early, and the voyage always runs longer than planned. Nobody ever plans for a voyage to go smoothly. History suggests they're right not to. So, the hold. Come take a look, because you'll be living out of this space for half a year, whether you like its contents or not. The first cargo you load isn't food at all. It's barrels. Empty ones, dozens of them, stacked and nested like a demonic Russian doll collection, because barrels are the shipping container of the age, the single most important piece of unglamorous technology on the entire vessel. Water goes in barrels. Beer goes in barrels. Salted meat goes in barrels, packed in its own brine. Even the ship's biscuit, dry as it is, sometimes travels in barrels lined with cloth to keep out damp. Here's the thing about barrels, though. They're wooden, which means they're never perfectly sealed, never entirely waterproof, and never immune to the small persistent armies of rot, mould, and vermin that consider a barrel of food to be less provisions and more real estate. You will spend a good portion of this voyage discovering exactly how creative nature can be about ruining stored food, and the barrel is where that education begins. The second thing you load is salted meat, beef and pork, packed in heavy brine, cut into chunks and crammed into barrels so tightly that sailors of the period had a specific, half-affectionate nickname for the tougher cuts: salt horse. Not because it was actually horse usually, but because by the time it had spent months curing in brine, it had roughly the tenderness, and occasionally the general shape, of a leather boot. Some sailors reportedly carved decorative buttons and trinkets out of particularly stubborn pieces of salt beef, less as a joke and more because the material genuinely held its shape better than most would. You'll also load casks of dried peas, sacks of oatmeal, wheels of hard cheese, jars of oil, and, crucially, enormous quantities of ship's biscuit, which we'll spend an entire chapter on shortly, because it deserves nothing less. For now, just know that it exists in staggering volume, stacked in the hold like the building blocks of an empire, because ordinary bread doesn't keep at sea. Biscuit does. Sort of. And finally, water. Endless barrels of water, because 6 months at sea without rain means you are entirely dependent on what you brought with you, and water, it turns out, does not remain water for very long once it's sealed inside a wooden barrel in a hot, damp hold. We'll get to what it becomes later tonight. It's not pleasant. Consider this your gentle warning shot. For now, the hold is filling up, the ship is sitting lower in the water with every load, and somewhere in your head, a small optimistic voice is saying, "This looks like a lot of food. Surely this will be plenty." That voice has never met month 4. Loading isn't just about volume, it's about arrangement, and this is where you learn your first real lesson in shipboard logistics. Everything that gets loaded last has to come out first, or at least everything that spoils fastest needs to be accessible without unpacking half the hold to get to it. So the heaviest, most durable stuff, the biscuit, the dried peas, the barrels of salt meat meant for the later months, goes down low and gets buried deep, because it isn't going anywhere for a while and it needs the ballast weight anyway. The perishables, what little fresh food comes aboard on departure day, live chickens, maybe a pig or two, fresh bread baked the morning of departure, fruit if you're lucky and departing somewhere tropical. Those stay near the top, near the galley, because they're not going to survive long regardless of where they're stored, and the crew intends to eat them fast, before the sea claims them first. Yes, live animals. It was extremely common on both naval and pirate vessels of the era to bring livestock aboard, chickens for eggs and eventually meat, sometimes a goat for milk, occasionally pigs. Congratulations, you are now sharing your workplace with a small, unhappy farm, one that will shrink steadily over the coming weeks as the animals become dinner one by one. There's something almost soothing about that mental image, honestly, like the ship carries its own tiny countdown clock, and every missing chicken means 1 week closer to land, or 1 week further from starvation, depending on how you want to look at it. The chickens, incidentally, do not enjoy the ocean. Neither do the pigs. You will not enjoy cleaning up after either of them in rough seas, and this is not a detail that makes it into most pirate movies, for reasons that should be obvious. Think of it as the world's least convenient meal prep service, delivered one increasingly seasick animal at a time. There's also the question of where all this weight sits relative to the ship's balance. Too much in one place and you list. Too much water low in the hold and you're sluggish. Too little and you're riding high and unstable in a storm. So there's natural science to this, worked out over generations of trial, error, and occasionally ships that simply tipped over in harbour because someone loaded the beer before the ballast. It happened. Sailors talked about it for years afterward, the way office workers today talk about the one colleague who replied all to the entire company by mistake. Worth noting too that not every pirate vessel faced this loading problem at the same scale. A small, fast sloop, favoured by many pirate crews specifically for its speed and shallow draft, simply didn't have the hold space of a larger, more heavily armed ship, which meant smaller vessels ran on tighter margins by necessity, restocking more frequently and carrying less of a buffer against the exact spoilage and shortfall we've been discussing. Larger ships, captured and refitted from bigger merchant or naval vessels, could carry considerably more in reserve, trading some speed and manoeuvrability for the simple comfort of a deeper hold and a longer runway before hunger became a pressing concern. Which kind of ship you'd signed on to, in other words, quietly shaped your entire relationship with food for the length of the voyage, well before a single barrel was ever loaded. By the time the hold is fully loaded, the ship sits noticeably deeper in the water than it did that morning, weighed down by roughly 6 months of human survival, packed into barrels, sacks, and one increasingly nervous group of livestock. It's an oddly emotional moment, actually, the last tangible proof, before departure, that someone back on land cared whether you lived or died out there. After this, you're on your own. Before the ship departs, there's paperwork, or the period equivalent of it, and this is where the quartermaster becomes, briefly, the most important person on the entire vessel, more important even than the captain. On a pirate ship specifically, this mattered more than people usually assume, because pirate crews, unlike naval crews, typically operated under a set of written articles the whole crew agreed to before sailing, and those articles very often addressed food directly, how rations would be divided, what happened if supplies ran short, sometimes even penalties for stealing food from the common stock. Here's a detail that tends to surprise people. On many pirate ships, the captain ate the same food as everyone else. Not always, not universally, but this was a real, documented point of difference from naval vessels, where officers dined considerably better than the crew, sometimes on an entirely different menu served in an entirely different room. Pirate crews, having collectively decided that they were done taking orders from people who ate better than them for no particular reason, frequently built equal rations directly into their governing rules. It's one of the stranger ironies of pirate history. Men who broke the law for a living were often working under fairer internal food policy than the legitimate navies they were evading. Make of that what you will. The quartermaster's job in this system was to keep an honest tally. How much of everything was aboard, how fast it was being consumed, and how that matched against the length of voyage planned. Run the math wrong and somewhere around month 4 you don't just have hungry men. You have hungry men who've already established in writing that they have the right to vote on what happens next. That's a genuinely bad combination for a captain to be sitting on, and everyone aboard knew it. So the tally gets checked. And rechecked, and the departure gets delayed by half a day because someone's convinced 3 barrels of biscuit went missing between the dock and the hold, and it takes several hours of increasingly tense searching to determine that no, actually, someone just miscounted, they're right where they should be, please stop yelling. This is the unglamorous truth sitting underneath every dramatic pirate tale you've ever heard, before the flag goes up, before the cannons are checked, before anyone even thinks about which ships to hunt. Someone spends an entire day worrying about biscuits. The adventure, in other words, is downstream of the accounting. It helps at this point to actually put some rough numbers to all this counting, because a lot of food is doing a great deal of vague work in most retellings of pirate provisioning, and the reality was considerably more specific than that. Naval and merchant records from this general era suggest a working figure somewhere in the neighbourhood of £1 of biscuit per man per day as a baseline allowance, alongside a couple of pounds of salt meat spread across the week, supplemented with the peas, oatmeal and cheese we've already mentioned. Multiply that out across a crew of 100 men and a voyage of roughly 26 weeks, and you're looking at a hold that needs to swallow something in the range of several tons of biscuit alone, before a single barrel of meat, water or drink gets counted. The escalating detail worth sitting with, these figures were never treated as a hard ceiling so much as a working average, adjusted constantly for exactly the kind of spoilage, infestation, and simple miscounting we've already discussed. A quartermaster planning a voyage didn't load precisely enough biscuit to hit that daily pound per man for exactly 26 weeks and call it finished. That would have been functionally a bet that nothing would go wrong for half a year, which nobody with any actual sailing experience was foolish enough to make. Instead, the real math built in a buffer, sometimes 20 or 30% beyond the bare theoretical requirement, specifically to absorb the losses everyone already knew were coming. Here's the dry joke buried in all this arithmetic, pirate provisioning, for all its reputation as a lawless seat-of-the-pants enterprise. Was in practice a more carefully modelled logistics exercise than plenty of legitimate businesses manage today, built entirely around the grim, hard-won institutional knowledge that roughly a third of everything you load is quietly going to be lost, ruined, or eaten by something other than the crew before the voyage ends. Modern supply chains call this shrinkage and write it off as a line item. A hungry 18th century sailor called it Tuesday. There's one more category of supply worth mentioning before the ship actually sails, and it's the one modern audiences find most surprising: alcohol, in genuinely enormous quantities, treated not as a luxury, but as a basic survival necessity. Here's the reasoning, and it's more practical than it sounds. Water in a wooden barrel, sitting in a warm hold for weeks or months, does not stay drinkable. We'll spend real time later tonight on exactly what it turns into, but for now, understand that sailors of this era had figured out, through generations of unpleasant trial and error, that beer, wine, and rum kept far better than plain water, and were less likely to make you violently ill. So the daily ration wasn't beer or rum as a treat, it was frequently beer or rum as the primary fluid intake, sometimes supplemented with water only once it had been mixed with something strong enough to mask what it had become. This meant loading truly staggering volumes of drink. Naval records from the era show sailors' daily rations running to a gallon of beer per man per day in some services. A figure that sounds less like provisioning and more like a dare. Pirate ships, operating with fewer restrictions and considerably less oversight, often had access to whatever they'd captured, which meant rum, brandy, wine, whatever the last prize ship happened to be carrying, layered on top of whatever original stores they'd departed with. The escalating problem here should be obvious. A crew that drinks throughout the working day, every day for 6 months, is a crew operating in a fairly constant low-grade state of intoxication, punctuated by occasional periods of considerably less low-grade intoxication whenever a captured ship's cargo happened to include something stronger. This wasn't universally true, and discipline varied wildly ship to ship, but it was common enough that historians studying shipboard life treat the crew was drinking most of the time less as scandal and more as baseline operating condition. Last of all, on the morning of departure itself, there's usually one final scramble, fresh bread baked in whatever ovens the port could offer, last farewells traded on the dock, a final barrel or two wedged in wherever space remains, and the quartermaster doing one absolute last count before the gangway comes up, because once the ship clears the harbour mouth, there is no correcting a mistake in the tally. Whatever's aboard is aboard. Whatever got left behind stays behind 6 months away. Which means that by the time your ship actually clears the harbour, the crew isn't just carrying 6 months of food. They're carrying 6 months of a habit that's about to become one of the only reliable comforts available to them, and one of the only things standing between them and drinking the water directly. We'll come back to exactly why that water becomes so dangerous. For now, just picture the ship pulling away from the dock, riding low and heavy, carrying a small floating farm, several tons of hard bread, barrels of meat that will eventually be mistaken for furniture, and enough alcohol to make an entire modern brewery blush, all of it meant to last 6 months, all of it already beginning the moment the ship left the dock, its slow and complicated process of going bad. That process has a name, and a shape, and like most things aboard a wooden ship, a rhythm all its own, which is exactly where we're headed next. Long before pirates existed, long before the so-called Golden Age of Piracy ever began, sailors had already solved, or thought they'd solved, the single hardest problem of long ocean voyages, How do you carry bread that doesn't go stale, doesn't mould, and doesn't spoil for months at a time in a wooden hold, with no refrigeration and no modern preservatives of any kind? Their answer, arrived at independently by multiple seafaring cultures over the centuries, was to remove almost everything that makes bread pleasant. Flour, water, sometimes a small amount of salt, mixed into a stiff, dense dough, rolled flat, and baked, not once, but often twice, sometimes more, at low heat, for a very long time, until nearly every trace of moisture had been driven out of it. The result was something less like bread and more like a dense, pale, rock-hard biscuit, roughly the size of a small plate, capable of surviving for months, sometimes, under the right conditions, for years, without rotting. This wasn't a pirate invention. The basic concept traces back centuries, with versions documented among Roman legions and various medieval seafaring peoples, refined over generations by navies and merchant fleets long before it ended up feeding pirate crews in the Caribbean and beyond. By the time the Golden Age of Piracy rolled around, roughly the late 1600s through the early 1700s, ship's biscuit, sometimes called hardtack in later usage, particularly in naval and military contexts, was simply the standard. Unquestioned foundation of shipboard diet across essentially every maritime nation and every kind of crew, legal or otherwise. Different nations had their own slight variations on the recipe and the baking process. Some historians note the English and Dutch versions tended to be somewhat thinner and harder baked than certain French or Spanish equivalents, which sometimes retained a touch more moisture and correspondingly spoiled a touch faster. None of these differences mattered much once a barrel had been sitting in a hold for 3 months. By that point, biscuit was biscuit, regardless of which navy's recipe it started from, and every version faced the exact same enemy. Because here's the thing that made it so valuable, and also so eventually horrifying. The very quality that made it useful, its extreme aggressive dryness, also made it a remarkably stable environment for something else entirely. While bacteria and mould struggle badly in an environment with almost no moisture, insects, it turns out, do not struggle nearly as much. And once a barrel or sack of biscuit had been sitting in a ship's hold for a few months, in warm, humid conditions, with the occasional bit of condensation finding its way in, well, let's just say the biscuit rarely travelled alone. Let's talk specifically and directly about the weevils, because this is the detail that tends to lodge permanently in people's brains once they hear it. And for good reason. The culprit, in most historical accounts, was a small beetle commonly referred to as the biscuit weevil or grain weevil, along with its larvae, which found ship's biscuit to be a genuinely excellent environment, dense enough to burrow into, dry enough to avoid mould competing for the same real estate, and present in essentially unlimited quantity for months at a time. Given a few weeks in a ship's hold, a barrel of biscuit that started out reasonably clean could develop a fairly robust internal population of insects and larvae living inside the biscuit itself, largely invisible from the outside. This is where the historical habit comes in that modern audiences find almost impossible to believe, except that it's extensively documented across multiple first-hand sailor accounts of the era. Before eating a piece of ship's biscuit, sailors developed the practice of tapping it firmly against the table, the side of a bowl, or the edge of a sea chest, specifically to knock loose whatever had taken up residence inside, so it could be brushed away before the biscuit was eaten. This wasn't a rare, disgusted last resort behaviour. It was routine. It was simply part of the process of eating bread, the same way you might casually check a piece of fruit for a bruise before biting into it. Sailors developed dark, practical humour around this, much the way modern people joke about workplace annoyances that everyone quietly agrees are terrible, but nobody can actually fix. Biscuit was sometimes eaten in the dark deliberately, not for atmosphere, but because it was considered easier not to see exactly what you were consuming. There are accounts, treated by historians with the appropriate grain of caution given how folklore tends to accumulate around these details, describing sailors joking that the meat was the best part of the biscuit, meaning, bluntly, the insects and larvae themselves incorporated involuntarily into every bite. Here's the escalating, slightly absurd detail. This wasn't universally treated as pure catastrophe. Ship's biscuit infested with weevils was still, nutritionally, mostly intact. The insects consumed relatively little of the actual material, and the protein contribution from the larvae themselves was, in a bleak sort of way, not nothing. Which means that on some level eating weevil-infested biscuit wasn't purely bread with unwanted extras. It was bread with a small, unplanned, thoroughly unappetizing protein supplement, several centuries before protein fortified became a marketing phrase people paid extra for voluntarily. Beyond the weevils, Ship's biscuit had a second, equally persistent problem. And this one came with a name almost as evocative as the food item itself: breadworms or biscuit worms. Small pale larvae that could riddle a biscuit with visible tunnels if an infestation went unchecked for long enough. Sailors sometimes described heavily infested biscuit as being essentially hollowed out from the inside, a dense outer shell with almost nothing but tunnels and insect activity within. A piece of bread that looked structurally, uncomfortably similar to a termite-riddled log. The countermeasures available to sailors were limited and largely reactive rather than preventative. Biscuit could be kept as dry as reasonably possible, stored away from damp areas of the hold, and rotated so older stock got used before newer stock, the maritime equivalent of first-in, first-out shelving in a modern kitchen. Except the stakes were avoid an insect population boom rather than avoid slightly stale crackers. Some crews reportedly baked biscuit a second time partway through a long voyage if facilities and fuel allowed, in an attempt to dry it out further and knock back infestation, though this obviously required fuel, time and functioning ovens that weren't always available mid-voyage. None of this fully solved the problem. It simply managed it, the way you manage a leaky roof rather than actually fixing it. By the time you're several months into a voyage, manage is the best available outcome, and everyone aboard has quietly adjusted their standards accordingly. This is, in a strange way, one of the more human details of this entire subject. Not that the biscuit had bugs in it, but that an entire population of sailors, across generations and nationalities, collectively decided this was simply an acceptable cost of going to sea, and built small rituals, the tapping, the darkness, the gallows humour, around living with it rather than solving it. There's a broader lesson buried in here, if you want one. Humans are remarkably good at normalising conditions that would seem completely unacceptable from the outside, provided the alternative, starving instead, is sufficiently worse. Ship's biscuit, weevils included, was never really acceptable by any reasonable modern standard. It was simply better than the alternative, and on a wooden ship in the middle of an ocean, better than the alternative is the only standard that actually matters. There's a final piece of the biscuit story worth telling before we move on, and it's less about the food itself and more about what its condition revealed about a ship's overall situation, because experienced sailors could apparently read a great deal about a voyage's progress just from the state of the bread locker. Fresh, minimally infested biscuit meant you were early in the voyage, or that the ship had recently made port and restocked. Heavily infested, crumbling, tunnel-riddled biscuit meant you were deep into a long stretch without resupply, and, more ominously, it meant the crew's other stores were probably in similarly rough shape, because biscuit infestation and general provisioning decline tended to track together over the course of a voyage. In this sense, the biscuit functioned almost like a rough, informal calendar, not marked in days, but in degree of insect activity, and any experienced sailor glancing into the bread barrel could probably estimate, with reasonable accuracy, how much longer the voyage had left before land became an urgent necessity rather than a distant hope. There's something almost poetic in that, if you squint, a ship's entire situation legible in the condition of its bread. Modern sailors have GPs, satellite weather tracking, instant communication with shore. These sailors had biscuit, and they read it like a fuel gauge, the same way you might glance at a car's dashboard and start doing quiet mental math about the nearest gas station. It's worth mentioning, too, that biscuit didn't simply sit loose in the hold alongside everything else. Larger, more organised vessels, particularly naval ones, sometimes designated an actual dedicated space for it, often called a bread room. Lined and sealed as well as period shipbuilding allowed specifically to keep this one critical item as dry and as insect-resistant as circumstances. Permitted. Pirate ships, being generally smaller, more improvised and considerably less standardised than naval vessels, didn't always have the luxury of such a purpose-built space, and often made do with whatever reasonably dry corner of the hold could be spared, which likely explains why pirate crews' own accounts of infestation tend to skew, if anything. Slightly worse than their naval counterparts' equivalent complaints. A dedicated bread room wasn't a guarantee against weevils by any means, but it was at least a deliberate attempt at damage control, and the ships that had one were, in this one narrow respect, marginally better positioned than the ships that didn't. Worth noting, too, biscuit taken as plunder from a captured ship carried its own separate biography entirely, unrelated to your own vessel's timeline. A prize ship several months into its own long crossing might hand over biscuit every bit as compromised as your own, sometimes worse, if it had been provisioned poorly or stored in a damper hold. A prize taken just days out of port, by contrast, might offer biscuit practically fresh by comparison, a small temporary luxury that vanished again within a couple of weeks of being combined with your own aging stock. Captured biscuit, in other words, didn't reset your ship's clock. It just briefly blended two different clocks together, before settling back into the same slow decline as everything else. Ship's biscuit left a linguistic and cultural fingerprint that outlasted the ships themselves by centuries, and it's worth pausing here to trace a few of those threads. The term hardtack, widely used in later naval and military contexts, particularly in accounts of 19th century navies and land armies, descends directly from this same basic food item. Soldiers in later conflicts, including the American Civil War, ate their own versions of essentially the same product, facing the same weevil problems, coining their own grim jokes about biscuits that seemed to shift slightly on their own. The problem, in other words, didn't disappear with the age of pirates. It simply migrated forward through history, following anywhere large groups of people needed food that could survive prolonged storage without refrigeration. There's also a quieter legacy in food culture more broadly. The basic technique behind ship's biscuit, reducing moisture to nearly zero to prevent spoilage, is a direct ancestor of principles still used in modern dry goods. Crackers and long shelf-life baked products, even if nobody today is tapping their crackers against the table to check for uninvited protein. The next time you eat a plain, dense cracker and think it could survive an apocalypse, you're not far off from the actual design intent of its several centuries-old ancestor. By month 4 or 5 of a voyage, biscuit that started out simply hard and unappetizing had usually become something closer to an ongoing negotiation between the crew and an entire ecosystem living inside their food supply. And they ate it anyway. Every day. For 6 months. That's not a punchline. That's just what 6 months at sea over open water actually required of a person. Insects included. Which brings us, appropriately, back to the rest of the day this biscuit was actually eaten alongside, because bread alone, however haunted, was never the entire meal. Once you're actually underway, the food routine settles into something closer to a schedule than a scramble, and this is where the ship's cook becomes a genuinely important figure aboard. Though cook is doing a lot of heavy lifting as a job title, because the position rarely required prior culinary experience. Here's a detail that surprises people every time. On many naval and merchant vessels of the era, the ship's cook was frequently a sailor who'd been injured or disabled in some prior service, missing a hand, a leg, an eye, and was assigned to the galley specifically because it was considered lighter duty, work that didn't require full physical capability. This was documented practice in several naval traditions of the period. Piracy, being somewhat less formally regulated, didn't always follow the same custom, but the general pattern: cook duty going to whoever was least suited for climbing rigging, held reasonably true across the era. So, your cook, quite possibly, is a man with one leg, standing in a galley the size of a modern closet, trying to prepare a hot meal for 150 men on an open flame aboard a wooden vessel that is actively rocking back and forth on ocean swells. If that sentence alone doesn't qualify as an extreme sport, I genuinely don't know what does. The galley itself was a small contained fire hazard by design, a brick or iron-lined hearth, carefully positioned and ventilated because an open flame on a wooden ship is roughly the nautical equivalent of juggling knives inside a fireworks warehouse. Cooking fires were lit for limited hours each day, not continuously, both to conserve fuel and to reduce the ever-present risk of the entire vessel going up in flames because someone got careless with the stew. This meant meals happened on a schedule, not on demand. You ate when the galley fire was lit, and you adjusted your appetite accordingly. A typical day, then, ran something like this. A light meal in the morning, often little more than biscuit and maybe a hot drink if supplies allowed. A main meal around midday, generally the day's one hot-cooked dish, and a lighter meal again in the evening, frequently cold, frequently just more biscuit, and whatever remained from midday. This is, for what it's worth, roughly 2 solid meals and a lot of hard bread, which sounds almost reasonable until you remember exactly what those 2 solid meals actually consisted of several months into a voyage. Let's actually sit down and eat that midday meal with you, because this is the version of shipboard food that's the closest thing to good, the version everyone remembers fondly later, once things get worse. The centerpiece is usually some form of stew, lobscouse if the ship's crew used the term, a rough combination of chopped salt meat, crumbled ship's biscuit, and whatever vegetables happened to still be aboard and edible, all boiled together into something thick enough to actually fill you up. The word survives, distantly, in the modern nickname for people from Liverpool, Scousers, a direct etymological descendant of this exact shipboard stew, which tells you something about how deeply this food worked its way into maritime culture generally. Alternatively, you might get burgoo, a thick oatmeal porridge, sometimes sweetened with molasses if any was aboard, sometimes not. Neither of these dishes would win any awards on land. Both were, by the standards of month 5 of the same voyage, an absolute feast, and this is worth sitting with for a second. The food that later becomes a nostalgic memory of the good times is itself boiled salt meat and hard bread mashed together in a pot. Perspective is a strange and relative thing, and nowhere more so than aboard a 6-month voyage. Here's the escalating detail that makes this less comforting the longer you think about it. The salt meat used in these stews needed extensive soaking and boiling just to become chewable, because straight out of the barrel it had roughly the texture of a shoe sole that had been left in salt water for several months, which, functionally, is exactly what it was. Cooks would sometimes soak it overnight, sometimes boil it for hours, and it would still emerge from the pot tough enough that biting into it was less eating and more negotiating. Beyond the meat and the biscuit, there was a small supporting cast of other staples worth introducing properly, because they had their own quiet decline underway too. Cheese, loaded aboard as hard wheels meant to keep for months, developed its own rind of mould that had to be cut away before eating, normal enough if you've ever kept cheese too long yourself, except multiplied across weeks at sea in a damp hold, with no fridge to slow it down. Dried peas, boiled soft for the stew pot, were a reasonably stable source of bulk and protein early on, though sacks of them were just as vulnerable to weevils as the biscuit was, and just as likely to arrive at the pot with unplanned extra ingredients. Oil, used sparingly for cooking and sometimes for lamps, could turn rancid in heat, leaving cooks to decide whether a slightly off batch was worth using anyway, given the alternative was using none at all. And the vegetables, when they existed at all, onions, some root vegetables, were a diminishing resource from the moment the ship left port, because nothing green survives 6 months at sea. So the stew you're eating in week 2, reasonably hearty and vaguely vegetable adjacent, is not the stew you'll be eating in week 20. It is, in fact, the best version of this exact dish you will encounter for the remainder of the voyage, and you don't even know it yet. Enjoy the onions while they last. They're not going to. Meals are eaten in shifts, in small groups called messes, typically 4 to 8 men sharing a portion of food, dividing it among themselves, which meant your messmates were, functionally, your closest social unit aboard ship. You ate with them, you likely worked watches with them, and, in the specific economy of shipboard food, you trusted them not to shortchange you when dividing up a piece of meat or a portion of biscuit that was already too small to begin with. Petty theft of food from one's messmates was taken seriously, and punished harshly when caught, precisely because trust over food division was one of the few things holding shipboard order together when everything else about the voyage was miserable. There's something almost touching in that, honestly, that in the middle of all this hardship, small groups of men built tiny functioning systems of mutual trust around a shared bowl of stew and a piece of bread hard enough to double as a paperweight. It's not the kind of detail that makes it into adventure films. It's exactly the kind of detail that made survival at sea, for 6 months at a stretch, actually possible. By evening, the fire's usually banked and cooling, and dinner is a considerably quieter affair, cold biscuit, maybe a scrap of the midday meat if any remained, washed down with whatever the day's drink ration happened to be. It's not a meal so much as a formality, a way of marking the day's end rather than actually satisfying much hunger, and most crews treated it accordingly, brief, functional, over quickly, everyone eager to get to whatever small comforts remained before sleep. And those small comforts mattered more than you'd expect. Between meals and watches, sailors found their own modest ways to pass the time and take the edge off the monotony. Games of cards or dice where permitted, singing, storytelling, mending clothes, carving small trinkets out of spare wood or, occasionally, out of particularly stubborn salt beef. Tobacco, where it was available, functioned as its own small ritual of comfort, something to look forward to between the thin morning meal and the thicker midday one. None of this changed what was in the pot, but it gave the day some texture beyond simply enduring it, and historians studying shipboard morale generally treat these small rituals as genuinely important to keeping a crew functional over months at sea, not merely incidental colour. Let's talk for a moment about what people actually drank alongside all of this, because we've mentioned rum and beer already, but the daily reality of shipboard hydration deserves its own honest accounting. And it starts with water, specifically with what happens to water after it's been sitting in a wooden barrel for 6 to 8 weeks in a warm, damp hold. Here's the mundane setup. You load clean, fresh water before departure, drawn from a river or well on shore, filled into barrels, sealed, and stored below deck. Simple enough. Here's the subversion. Within a matter of weeks, that water begins to grow things. Algae, bacteria, a slick, sometimes visibly green film. The wood of the barrel itself contributes flavour, and not the pleasant kind. By month 2 or 3, drinking water aboard a sailing vessel of this era had, by multiple documented accounts, developed a smell, a colour, and occasionally a texture that made drinking it in its raw state something close to an act of desperation. Sailors developed workarounds. Vinegar was sometimes added to disguise the taste, and, they believed, to help purify it, a folk remedy with some minor practical merit, though nowhere near enough to fully counteract weeks of stagnation. More commonly, the water was simply mixed with beer, wine or spirits strong enough to mask what had happened to it. Which is part of why alcohol wasn't treated as recreational aboard ship. It was, quite literally, water treatment technology, several centuries before anyone understood germ theory well enough to explain why it sort of worked. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it recontextualizes something people usually find funny about pirate life, the constant drinking, into something a little sadder and considerably more practical. It wasn't hedonism, or wasn't only hedonism. It was, in large part, the least unpleasant available option for staying hydrated on a vessel where the actual water had started actively growing its own ecosystem. It's the pirate version of knowing your tap water's questionable, so you just always buy bottled, except 6 months long, and the bottled water was rum. Naval and merchant records of the era occasionally break the week down by specific day, and though pirate crews weren't bound to any official schedule handed down from a distant admiralty, most fell into a broadly similar pattern simply because the same underlying stores and the same underlying constraints applied. Salt beef might feature more heavily on some days, salt pork on others, with a lighter day worked in here or there built around little more than oatmeal, cheese and biscuit, partly to stretch the meat supply further, and partly because a full week of nothing but heavy stew and salt meat sat about as well on an 18th century stomach as it would on yours. Fridays, aboard crews with any lingering religious observance carried over from more conventional societies. Sometimes leaned toward fish where it was available, less out of strict doctrine among a population not exactly known for its church-going habits, and more out of simple, long-ingrained cultural habit that had followed these men to see along with everything else they'd brought from land. The escalating detail worth noting here, this rough weekly rotation wasn't written down and posted anywhere aboard a pirate ship the way it might have been on a naval vessel operating under more formal admiralty regulations. It existed instead as an informal, semi-remembered custom, carried in the collective habits of cooks and quartermasters who'd served on enough ships to know roughly how the week was supposed to feel, even without a formal schedule to consult. Consistency, in other words, came less from written policy and more from institutional muscle memory. The same reason a home cook without a written meal plan still tends to fall into a recognizable weekly rhythm without ever quite deciding to. By the time you've settled fully into the rhythm of these days, thin breakfast, hearty-ish stew at noon, quiet cold supper, small comforts squeezed in between watches, you've more or less adapted to shipboard life. It's not comfortable. It's not particularly appetizing. But it is, at least for a while, sustainable, which is more than can be said for the thing quietly working against every man aboard, whether he can feel it yet or not. Scurvy doesn't arrive suddenly. That's part of what made it so insidious and so poorly understood for centuries. It crept in slowly, disguised at first as ordinary shipboard fatigue, the kind of tiredness anyone would expect after weeks of hard physical labour on limited food. A little sluggishness here, some aching joints there. Nothing, at first, that seemed to warrant real alarm. Here's the subversion. By week 8 to 12 without adequate fresh food, the exact timeline varied by individual, but this general window shows up repeatedly across historical accounts. That ordinary tiredness began sliding into something far more alarming. Gums swelling, turning spongy, sometimes bleeding on their own. Old wounds and long-healed scars reopening, as though the body's healing process itself had started running in reverse. Teeth loosening in their sockets, sometimes falling out entirely with barely any pressure. Joints aching deeply, bruising appearing seemingly at random across the skin, and an overwhelming bone-deep lethargy that left even simple tasks feeling monumental. We now understand, and this understanding came centuries after the worst of the suffering, that scurvy is a deficiency disease caused by prolonged lack of vitamin C, a nutrient the human body cannot produce or store for long, and one that's almost entirely absent from a diet built around salted meat and dry biscuit. Vitamin C is essential for producing collagen, the connective tissue holding blood vessels, gums, and healed wounds together, which explains with grim biological precision exactly why the disease's symptoms centre so heavily on bleeding, on wounds reopening, on the body seeming to structurally unravel from the inside out. But here's the escalating, darkly ironic detail. Nobody sailing in the Golden Age of Piracy actually understood any of this. The concept of vitamins didn't exist yet. It wouldn't be formally identified for roughly another 2 centuries. So sailors and their captains were left guessing, working from folk theory, superstition, and whatever half-correct observations previous generations had passed down, trying to explain a disease that was, in hard biochemical fact, entirely preventable with something as simple as regular access to citrus fruit or fresh vegetables, if only anyone had understood why. It's the historical equivalent of watching someone struggle for years to fix a problem while the actual solution sits in plain sight the entire time, misunderstood and dismissed. Except the stakes here weren't inconvenience, they were death, on a scale that dwarfed combat losses across the entire age of sail, several times over. The theories sailors and physicians developed to explain scurvy, in the absence of any real biochemical understanding, ranged from the reasonably close to the wildly off-base, and it's worth walking through a few, because they reveal just how hard this problem actually was to solve, without modern science. Some believed scurvy was caused by bad air, a general theory of disease common across much of this era, which held that foul, stagnant air below decks caused a wide range of ailments, plausible sounding, given how genuinely unpleasant shipboard air often was, but entirely wrong as an explanation for this specific condition. Others suspected laziness or poor moral discipline among the crew, a theory that says considerably more about period attitudes toward illness and class than it does about actual medicine, and one that led to some truly unhelpful treatment approaches, including forced labour for men already suffering symptoms severe enough that walking was difficult. Some closer guesses did exist. Various sailors, physicians, and ship captains across different maritime nations had, independently and informally, noticed over the generations that crews with more regular access to fresh fruit and vegetables seemed to suffer less. But these observations remained scattered, inconsistent, and largely unsystematic for a very long time, treated as anecdote rather than reliable pattern. The Portuguese and Dutch, with their long trade routes through regions rich in citrus and fresh produce, are noted in some historical accounts as having somewhat better outcomes on certain routes, though historians treat these comparisons carefully, since so many variables affected any given voyage's health outcomes beyond diet alone. The real turning point most commonly cited came later than the Golden Age of Piracy itself, the work of Scottish naval surgeon James Lind, who in 1747 conducted what's often described as one of the earliest controlled clinical trials in medical history, dividing scurvy-afflicted sailors into groups given different proposed remedies: cider, vinegar, seawater, and citrus fruit among them, and observing that the men given citrus recovered dramatically faster than the others. It took several more decades after Lind's findings for the British Royal Navy to formally adopt regular citrus rations as policy, a delay that historians generally attribute to slow institutional adoption of new medical evidence rather than any genuine scientific disagreement about the results. This is worth flagging clearly and honestly. Lind's experiment happened after the classic Golden Age of Piracy had largely ended, which means, somewhat tragically, that most of history's most famous pirates operated and died without ever benefiting from, or even being aware of, the solution to one of the deadliest threats they faced at sea. Blackbeard never knew about vitamin C, neither did Bartholomew Roberts. The knowledge that could have spared countless sailors simply hadn't been formalised yet, and wouldn't be for decades after their deaths. Here's where pirate history intersects with this disease In a genuinely interesting, if somewhat accidental way, pirates, as a general pattern, may actually have suffered somewhat less from scurvy than their naval counterparts, for reasons that had nothing to do with any medical understanding and everything to do with the practical realities of how pirates operated. Naval vessels of major powers were often engaged in long-sustained blockades or extended patrol routes, sometimes keeping ships at sea for extraordinary lengths of time, with minimal opportunity for landfall. Pirate crews, by contrast, generally operated on a fundamentally different rhythm. They needed frequent access to ports, whether legitimate or otherwise, to sell captured goods, resupply, careen their ships, and generally sustain the entire economic engine that piracy depended on. This meant more frequent landfalls, and more frequent landfalls meant more frequent access to fresh food, fruit and vegetables, even if nobody involved understood why that mattered biologically. It's an important historical caveat, and one worth stating explicitly rather than letting the pattern harden into an overstated claim. This wasn't a universal rule, and there's considerable variation across different pirate crews, regions, and time periods, along with gaps in the surviving record that make broad generalizations risky. Some pirate voyagers absolutely did suffer from scurvy and other food-related illnesses, particularly longer raiding voyages that ranged far from friendly or accessible coastlines. But as a general historical pattern, the more port-dependent, opportunistic operating style of piracy likely did offer some accidental protective effect against the worst outcomes of prolonged vitamin deficiency, purely as a side effect of lifestyle rather than any deliberate health strategy. There's something almost funny about that, in the driest possible sense. Pirates, stereotyped across centuries of popular culture as reckless and undisciplined, may have inadvertently outnutritioned some of the world's most powerful, well-funded navies, simply because piracy's business model required them to keep making shore visits that happened to also keep them marginally healthier. It's not a triumph of planning. It's a triumph of incidental logistics, the same way someone who changes jobs frequently might accidentally end up with a more varied diet than someone who eats the same cafeteria meal every day for a decade, purely because circumstances kept forcing variety on them. Worth a brief mention, too, scurvy wasn't the only deficiency-related illness lurking in a diet this narrow, though it was by far the most documented and the most severe. Diets built almost entirely around refined grains and preserved meat, with little variety, could contribute to other nutritional problems as well, generally showing up as a broader pattern of fatigue, weakness, and slow healing, rather than any single dramatic symptom. Historians and modern nutritional researchers looking back at ships' logs and surgeons' records generally treat scurvy as the headline story of this era for good reason. Its symptoms were the most visible, the most severe, and the most consistently recorded. But it's worth remembering that it likely wasn't operating entirely alone. Scurvy's legacy reaches directly into modern English, in a way that's easy to miss unless you're specifically looking for it. Once the British Royal Navy formally adopted citrus rations, historically most associated with lime juice, distributed to sailors as a preventative measure well after the Golden Age of Piracy had ended, British sailors picked up a nickname among other nations' seafarers that survived, in altered form, into the present day, limeys, a term originally rooted directly in this citrus rationing policy, eventually broadening in casual usage into a general, informal nickname for British people at large. It's a strange kind of immortality for a public health policy, outliving the ships, outliving the Empire's naval dominance, outliving nearly everyone who ever actually drank the ration, and surviving instead as a light-hearted nickname most people using it today have no idea originated from a centuries-old anti-scurvy measure. Language is like that sometimes. It keeps fragments of history alive long after the original context has been almost entirely forgotten. The way a fossil preserves the shape of something that otherwise left no trace at all. One especially well-documented later example, worth mentioning even though it falls somewhat after the classic Golden Age of Piracy proper, helps put a concrete scale on just how devastating this disease could be, when a voyage ran long without adequate resupply. British naval commander George Anson's circumnavigation of the globe in the 1740s. Undertaken with a squadron of several ships and several thousand men combined, suffered scurvy losses so severe that only a small fraction of the original crews survived to complete the voyage, with the disease responsible for far more deaths across the expedition than any storm, shipwreck or hostile engagement along the way. Anson's own officers left written accounts describing the disease's progression in stark, specific detail, and the scale of loss on that particular expedition is often cited by historians as one of the key pieces of evidence that eventually helped push naval authorities toward taking Lynn's later findings seriously. The escalating, sobering detail worth sitting with, Anson's voyage happened only a couple of decades after pirates like Roberts and Blackbeard were still active in the Caribbean and off the African coast, which means the same disease that had quietly stalked pirate crews throughout the earlier Golden Age was, within a single generation, still killing sailors by the thousands on the era's most prestigious, best-funded naval expeditions. The knowledge gap wasn't unique to piracy, in other words. It was a gap the entire maritime world shared, pirates and admirals alike, for considerably longer than hindsight makes comfortable to admit. There's a broader legacy too. Beyond just the nickname, scurvy stands as one of history's clearest examples of a problem that was entirely solvable the whole time. Sitting in plain sight, simply waiting for the right systematic observation and enough institutional patience to actually act on it. It took the deaths of an almost unimaginable number of sailors. Historians' estimates for scurvy's total toll across the age of sail run into the hundreds of thousands, dwarfing combat losses across the same era many times over, before the solution finally became standard practice. That's a genuinely sobering thought to sit with for a moment. More sailors died from a lack of citrus fruit than were ever killed by cannons, cutlasses or shipwrecks combined across the centuries this affected seafaring populations. Here's the subversion. Month 4 is, historically, right around where stores that seemed abundant on departure day start visibly, undeniably running thin, and where the compounding effects of insects, spoilage, and simple consumption finally catch up with the optimistic math done back on the dock. The fresh meat is long gone. Those chickens and pigs loaded back on day 1 didn't survive nearly this long. Obviously, the good biscuit, the least infested stock, has been worked through, leaving the more heavily compromised barrels further down in the hold. And the crew, having been on reduced or carefully managed rations for weeks already in anticipation of exactly this shortfall, is beginning to feel it, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, grinding way that hunger and fatigue accumulate over time. The escalating detail, this is also roughly when rats become an undeniable active problem rather than a background nuisance. Ships of this era were, without exception, home to rat populations. No wooden vessel loaded with months of food supply managed to keep them out entirely, and by month 4, those rat populations had had ample time to establish themselves, breed, and develop a fairly thorough working knowledge of exactly where the food was stored. Rats ate stores directly, contaminated far more than they consumed by gnawing into sacks and barrels and leaving droppings behind, and were themselves on some particularly hard, pressed vessels across maritime history, occasionally consumed by desperate crews when nothing else remained, a detail more commonly documented in extreme famine situations aboard various ships across the age of sail generally, rather than a routine part of pirate diet specifically, but worth acknowledging honestly as the far end of what desperation could look like. The dry joke, such as it is, somewhere around month 4, on a lot of these voyages, the rats were arguably eating better than the crew. Smaller portions, sure, but drawing from the same limited stores, with none of the physical labour burning through their reserves nearly as fast. It's not a flattering comparison for anyone involved, least of all the humans losing the competition. Let's talk specifically about rationing, because this is where the earlier math, all that careful provisioning done on the dock, either pays off, or catastrophically doesn't. A well-run ship with a competent quartermaster and reasonably accurate initial planning would have begun reducing rations gradually well before supplies actually ran critically low, spreading the shortage out across the remaining weeks rather than hitting a sudden wall partway through. This meant smaller portions of meat, thinner stews stretched further with whatever biscuit and starch remained, and closer rationing of the drink supply, which, remember, was doing double duty as both morale booster and practical water substitute. Here's the compounding problem. Reduced rations don't just mean hungrier sailors. They mean less energy for the genuinely hard physical labour that running a ship required, hauling rigging, working pumps, standing long watches. At exactly the point in the voyage when the ship itself was also showing wear, when morale was already strained, and when tempers, predictably, were shorter than they'd been back in the relatively comfortable early weeks. This is precisely the kind of environment where the written articles we discussed earlier, the rules governing food division, the penalties for theft from common stores, stopped being a formality and started being genuinely, actively enforced. Because a crew running low on food and patience simultaneously is a crew one bad decision away from serious internal conflict. Historical accounts of pirate voyages that ran into serious food shortages describe exactly this kind of rising tension, arguments over portion sizes, suspicion falling on anyone suspected of taking more than their fair share, and in the more severe documented cases, genuine breakdowns in shipboard order tied directly to food scarcity. It's worth remembering in these moments that pirate crews had chosen this life partly because it offered more control, more say, more equal treatment than legitimate maritime work of the era, which meant that when food ran short, crews weren't simply going to suffer in silence. They had, quite literally, written themselves the right to complain, loudly and formally, and they used it. There's a strange kind of dark comfort in that actually, even at their hungriest, most desperate moments, these crews retained a level of collective voice and agency that was rare for working sailors of the era generally. It didn't make the hunger less real, but it meant the hunger was, at least, a shared and openly acknowledged problem, rather than something suffered silently under someone else's unquestioned authority. Let's return to the water situation, because by month 4, the water, already questionable by month 2 as we established earlier, has typically progressed well past questionable into territory that's genuinely difficult to describe without a small amount of gagging on your own behalf, safely from the comfort of your bed, several centuries removed from actually having to drink it. By this stage in a voyage, remaining water stores had often developed thick sediment, a persistent unpleasant odour, and in the more severe documented cases, visible organic growth that sailors sometimes described needing to strain out through cloth before drinking, more out of psychological necessity than any real effectiveness at removing the actual contamination. The escalating detail here is that this wasn't a fixable problem mid-voyage. There was no way to purify or meaningfully improve water quality once it had degraded this far, using the technology and understanding available at the time. The only real countermeasures were the ones already established: heavy dilution with alcohol strong enough to mask the taste, or simply enduring it, in smaller and smaller sips, hoping the next port wasn't too many weeks away. And here's where the alcohol ration, discussed earlier as almost a comfort, reveals its darker underside by month 4. As water quality declined and rationing tightened simultaneously, alcohol wasn't just the preferred beverage anymore. It was, in a very real sense, becoming one of the only reliably safe sources of fluid remaining aboard, at exactly the point where supplies of it were also being carefully rationed to make sure the voyage's remaining weeks were actually survivable. Crews found themselves in the deeply uncomfortable position of needing to ration the very thing standing between them and the worst of the contaminated water, which created its own quiet, grinding anxiety layered on top of everything else. It's the pirate version of realizing your emergency backup water supply is also running low, except there's no store to restock from for another several weeks, and the backup supply happens to also be alcoholic. There's a particular kind of shipboard illness worth mentioning here, distinct from scurvy, that tended to cluster around exactly this stage of a long voyage, general dysentery and other gastrointestinal illness, driven by some combination of contaminated water, spoiling food, and cramped unsanitary living conditions that only worsened as a voyage dragged on. Historical records across naval and pirate vessels alike describe dysentery as a persistent, genuinely dangerous problem throughout the age of sail, sometimes killing more sailors on a given voyage than combat, storms, or any other single cause combined. The mundane, falsely reassuring setup here is that dysentery sounds, from a modern remove, like a relatively minor digestive complaint. The sort of thing you might associate today with bad takeout food and a rough weekend. The subversion is that, aboard a ship with no real medical treatment beyond rest, and whatever folk remedies were available, dysentery could be genuinely, seriously lethal, dehydration compounding rapidly in someone whose fluid options were already limited to questionable water and rationed alcohol. In a body already weakened by months of inadequate nutrition, cramped sleeping quarters meant illness spread fast among a crew living in close proximity for months at a stretch, and the physical labour requirements of running a ship didn't pause for illness. A sick sailor still generally needed to contribute what he could, given how few hands were available to cover for him. There's a quieter, more psychological toll worth naming honestly alongside the physical one, because hunger of this slow, grinding kind doesn't just wear down the body. Sailors' own accounts and captains' logs from difficult voyages describe rising superstition during lean stretches, bad luck blamed on a whistling wind, an unlucky word spoken at the wrong moment, a jinx supposedly carried aboard by an unlucky prize or an unlucky new recruit. None of this fixed the actual shortage, but it gave a crew something to point at, some sense of explanation and, occasionally, of control, in a situation that otherwise offered very little of either. It's a very old, very human response to prolonged deprivation, when the real cause of your suffering is simply math. Too many mouths, not enough barrels, sometimes it's easier, and oddly more bearable to blame the ship's luck instead. Despite all of this, the rationing, the rats, the water, the mounting illness, the superstition, it's worth pausing to note something genuinely remarkable. Most 6-month pirate voyages did not end in catastrophic starvation. Crews suffered, certainly, and suffered significantly by any modern standard. But the actual planning that went into provisioning, however grim its results by month 4 or 5, was generally designed with enough margin and enough intention to make port before things became truly desperate, that most voyagers managed to limp through to resupply before crossing from miserable into genuinely life-threatening territory. This is where the earlier emphasis on careful dockside accounting pays quiet, unglamorous dividends. The quartermaster's obsessive tallying, the deliberate early rationing, the built-in buffer stock loaded specifically because something always spoils early, all of that unglamorous planning is precisely what stood between month 4's genuine hardship and something considerably worse. It's not a dramatic story. There's no cannon fire in it. But it's arguably one of the most important, least told aspects of what actually kept pirate crews alive across these long voyages. Not bravery, not swordplay, but careful, boring logistics, executed competently enough back on the dock to still be paying off months later. And when land finally did appear on the horizon, however many weeks later than anyone aboard would have preferred, it meant something considerably more significant than simple relief. It meant the entire brutal arithmetic of the voyage was for a little while about to reset. Which brings us to a different kind of pirate entirely, not a single legendary captain, but an entire way of life built specifically, deliberately, around solving this exact food problem, in a part of the world where the ships themselves first learned how to do it. Long before the word pirate conjures the image most people carry today, the flag, the ship, the open ocean raiding, there existed a distinct earlier community along the coasts and islands of the Caribbean, particularly on Hispaniola and the small nearby island of Tortuga, whose entire way of life was built around a food preservation technique borrowed directly from the indigenous peoples of the region, and whose name, remarkably, gave us both the word buccaneer and eventually the word barbecue. Here's the origin, according to the historical record. In the early to mid-1600s, various European settlers, escaped indentured servants, shipwreck survivors, and general outcasts began establishing small, loosely organised hunting communities across parts of Hispaniola, living off the vast herds of wild cattle and pigs that had descended from animals originally introduced by earlier Spanish colonisation, now roaming largely feral across the island. These hunters made their living smoking and drying the meat of these animals using a technique adapted from the indigenous Taino and Arawak peoples of the region, meat laid across a wooden frame set over a smouldering fire, slowly cured and preserved through smoke and heat rather than salt alone. The frame itself was called, in the local indigenous term the settlers adopted, a bocan, and the hunters who used it became known, in French, as boucaniers, a term that anglicised over time into the word we recognise today, buccaneer. This is, incidentally, also the likely root of the word barbecue, believed to descend from a related indigenous term for the raised wooden framework used in this same cooking method, meaning that two words most people associate today with either piracy or backyard cookouts share a genuinely direct historical and linguistic origin, born from the exact same food preservation technique on the exact same Caribbean islands. These early buccaneers weren't yet pirates in the sense we usually mean. They were hunters and meat traders, selling smoked beef and pork to passing ships in exchange for goods, supplies and coin, operating a legitimate, if rough-edged, trade economy along these coastlines. Their transformation into something closer to organised piracy came later, driven largely by escalating conflict with Spanish colonial authorities, who viewed these informal hunting communities as trespassers on contested territory, and launched repeated efforts to drive them out entirely. That Spanish pressure, repeated raids intended to wipe out the buccaneer hunting communities entirely, destroy their herds, and eliminate their presence from the region, had the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than dispersing quietly, many of these hunters, having lost their land-based livelihood, drifted toward the nearby island of Tortuga and increasingly toward the sea itself, applying the same rough self-organisation, the same practical resourcefulness, and, crucially for tonight's purposes, the same deep practical knowledge of Caribbean food sources toward a new and considerably more dangerous trade, raiding shipping in the region, first against the Spanish specifically, and eventually more broadly. This is where the buccaneers formally enter pirate history proper, forming loose confederations sometimes referred to collectively as the Brethren of the Coast, an informal alliance of these Caribbean-based raiders operating from bases like Tortuga, later extending to Port Royal in Jamaica once English colonial authorities began, controversially, tolerating and even quietly encouraging such raiders as a useful check against Spanish power in the region. Tortuga and Port Royal both grew, in their own way, into rough boomtowns fueled directly by this economy, places where captured cargo could be sold, ships repaired and restocked, and crews could spend their earnings on exactly the sort of fresh food and drink that made those brief stretches on land so valuable after months at sea. Sources disagree somewhat on the precise organisational structure of the Brethren of the Coast, and historians treat some of the more romanticised accounts of their internal codes and unity with appropriate scepticism, but the general pattern, former hunters turned sea raiders, retaining strong Caribbean regional knowledge, is well documented. One of the most famous figures to emerge from this exact background was Henry Morgan, a Welsh privateer and eventual buccaneer leader who rose to considerable prominence in the mid to late 1600s, operating with a degree of official English sanction that blurred, depending on the specific voyage and the political winds of the moment, the line between privateer and outright pirate. Morgan's raids against Spanish colonial holdings, including notable attacks on Panama and Puerto Príncipe, made him one of the most feared and successful raiders of his era, successful enough that he was eventually knighted and appointed to a colonial governorship in Jamaica. A genuinely remarkable career arc for a man who'd spent significant portions of his life engaged in activity that, from the Spanish perspective at least, looked indistinguishable from straightforward piracy. Morgan's story deserves, honestly, its own full episode someday. There's far more there than food history alone can cover. But for tonight's purposes, what matters is the food knowledge these buccaneer-turned-pirate crews carried with them from their hunting days. An intimate, practical familiarity with Caribbean livestock, foraging and preservation techniques that gave many of these crews a genuine advantage in provisioning that purely European naval crews, less familiar with the region, simply didn't have to the same degree. That advantage showed up most clearly in a food source we've mentioned briefly already, but haven't given proper attention: the sea turtle. Specifically the green sea turtle, which became one of the single most important fresh food sources for pirates and other sailors operating throughout the Caribbean during this era. Here's why turtles mattered so much, and it comes down to a simple, elegant piece of practical logistics. Turtles, unlike essentially every other fresh meat source available to a ship's crew, could be flipped onto their backs and kept alive on deck for genuinely extended periods, weeks, in many documented cases, without food or water, and without spoiling, because they simply weren't dead yet. This made turtles, functionally, a self-preserving, self-transporting larder, fresh meat that didn't need salting, didn't need barreling, and didn't attract the same insect and spoilage problems as literally every other food item we've discussed tonight. This wasn't a minor or occasional practice. It was significant enough, historically, that turtle hunting became a genuine economic and provisioning activity across the Caribbean during this era, with hunters specifically targeting turtle nesting grounds on various islands, and turtle meat becoming a reliable, recognized staple in the diets of sailors, pirates and colonists throughout the region. The escalating detail, and one that carries real weight beyond mere trivia, this level of sustained hunting pressure across generations contributed significantly to the collapse of Caribbean green sea turtle populations over the following centuries. A genuinely serious ecological consequence that historians and conservation biologists have traced directly back to exactly this kind of provisioning practice, repeated at scale across hundreds of years of maritime activity in the region. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because it's a rare moment where this food history connects directly and measurably to a modern environmental reality. The Caribbean's still recovering sea turtle populations carry, in a very literal sense, the accumulated weight of centuries of exactly this kind of shipboard provisioning necessity. Beyond turtles, buccaneer-descended pirate crews operating in and around the Caribbean drew on a genuinely broad range of foraged and traded food sources that set their diet apart, at least periodically, from the grim biscuit and salt meat baseline we've spent most of tonight establishing. Wild hogs and cattle, descendants of the same feral herds the original buccaneers had hunted, remained a viable food source on various Caribbean and nearby coastal landing points well into the pirate era proper. Coconuts, plantains, and other tropical produce were available at numerous islands and coastal stops throughout the region, either foraged directly or traded for with local populations and settlements. Some crews also gathered sea salt directly, evaporated from shallow coastal pans where conditions allowed, supplementing whatever salt they'd carried aboard for preserving future catches, a small but useful bit of self-sufficiency that meant a good Caribbean landfall could restock more than just fresh food alone. Fishing, too, played a role that's easy to underestimate: hook and line fishing from the ship itself, or from smaller boats when anchored near shore, could supplement the diet meaningfully during calmer stretches of a voyage, particularly in the fish-rich waters of the Caribbean and along various trade routes. This wasn't a guaranteed or consistent food source. Weather, location, and simple luck all played a role. But it represents another way that pirate crews, operating with the flexibility and local knowledge many of them carried from their buccaneer origins, could periodically break the monotony of preserved shipboard rations with something genuinely fresh. There's an important larger point sitting underneath all of this, worth stating plainly. Piracy of this era wasn't a uniform, single lifestyle experienced identically by everyone who ever sailed under a black flag. Crews with strong roots in Caribbean buccaneering culture, carrying generations of accumulated regional food knowledge, likely ate meaningfully better, on average across a given voyage, than crews operating further from these networks, in less familiar waters with less established local trading relationships. Piracy, in other words, had its own quiet food hierarchy, shaped not by wealth or rank in the usual sense, but by regional knowledge and connection, a detail that rarely makes it into the popular imagination, which tends to picture pirate life as uniformly grim across the board. That regional knowledge paid off most visibly whenever a ship actually made landfall to careen, beaching or tilting the vessel to scrape barnacles and marine growth off the hull, essential regular maintenance that kept the ship seaworthy and reasonably fast. This sounds like tedious, unglamorous ship maintenance, and mostly it was. But careening stops doubled, almost universally, as major food gathering opportunities and crews with buccaneer-style regional knowledge took full advantage. Hunting parties went ashore after wild hogs or cattle were available. Turtle hunters worked nesting beaches. Fishing intensified in the calmer coastal waters. Fresh water sources, actual rivers and springs, blessedly free of months of barrel stagnation, were located and casks refilled, an upgrade in drinking quality that after months of the alternative must have felt almost indulgent. And here, finally, arrives the genuine warmth this chapter has been building toward. After months of hardship, the weevils, the rationing, the rats, the increasingly grim water, there is something almost profoundly moving about a crew of exhausted, malnourished men stepping onto solid ground, eating fresh fruit for the first time in months, tasting actual clean water, watching a fire roast real meat instead of boiling ancient salt beef into something merely chewable. It's a small human moment of restoration, repeated countless times across countless voyages throughout this entire era. Proof that no matter how grim the preceding months, the human capacity for relief, for gratitude, for simple pleasure in a good meal remained fully intact, waiting patiently on the other side of the hardship for its moment to return. This closes a loop worth appreciating. The very same buccaneer origins that gave us the words buccaneer and barbecue also gave certain pirate crews a genuine practical food security advantage over their less regionally rooted counterparts. A quiet legacy of hungry hunters on Hispaniola learning food preservation from the indigenous peoples of the region. That rippled forward through decades of pirate history in ways that shaped not just what these crews ate, but, in some meaningful sense, how well they survived. Sometimes, though, the fastest way to restock wasn't hunting or foraging at all. Sometimes it was simply finding another ship and asking it, quite forcefully, to share. You're several weeks into this leg of the voyage, rations already tightening, when the lookout calls down that there's a sail on the horizon. Here's the mundane setup. This happens constantly. Ships spot other ships all the time, most of them too far off, too fast, too well armed, or simply too uninteresting to bother with, and the vast majority of sightings end with nothing more than everyone going back to whatever they were doing. So your first reaction, historically, wasn't excitement. It was mild, weary curiosity, the nautical equivalent of glancing up when a car passes your house. Here's the subversion. This one doesn't get ignored. The captain and quartermaster study the sail through a glass, note her rig. Her waterline, the way she's sitting in the water, heavy and low, usually meant cargo, and cargo meant exactly the kind of prize a crew running low on biscuit was hoping for, and the order goes out to give chase. Now the mood on deck changes fast, and not in the way you'd expect from popular imagination. There's very little shouting, very little drawn steel at this stage. Mostly there's quiet, practical activity, sails adjusted, guns readied more as a formality than an expectation, and the black flag, or whatever specific, deliberately terrifying banner this crew favoured, run up the mast. The escalating detail worth sitting with here, the flag wasn't decoration. It was a tool, and arguably the single most effective piece of equipment aboard for the specific job of getting food without a fight. A merchant captain who saw that flag and understood what it meant had a real, practical incentive to strike his colours and surrender immediately. Because pirate crews of this era, with some well-documented exceptions, generally treated crews who surrendered without resistance far better than crews who forced a costly, dangerous fight first. Surrender fast, and you might lose your cargo but keep your ship, your crew, and your life. Resist, and the calculation changed considerably. So the dry joke, and it's barely even a joke, the Jolly Roger functioned less like a declaration of war and more like an extremely aggressive closed for negotiation sign, one designed specifically to make the other party skip the negotiation entirely and just hand over the goods. It's the 17th century version of a very convincing warning message. Nobody wants to find out what happens if they test it, so mostly nobody does. And on the days it worked exactly as intended, sails struck, no shots fired, no one hurt, that's when the real work of the day actually began. The moment you're aboard the captured vessel, before anyone touches the strongbox, before anyone even thinks seriously about jewellery or fine cloth or whatever cargo the manifest claims is stowed below, someone experienced goes straight for the galley and the hold. This wasn't greed getting the priorities backwards. It was the opposite. It was a crew that had spent the last several weeks quietly doing math about biscuit barrels, finally getting a chance to check whether tonight's dinner just got dramatically better. Here's the falsely comforting assumption a new hand might make. Surely the good stuff, coin, silk, sugar, whatever made this ship worth chasing in the first place, gets grabbed first, and food is an afterthought. Picked over once the real plunder's secured. Here's the subversion. On a ship with a crew has been rationing water for a month, a hold full of fresh bread, unspoiled meat, and clean drinking casks was, in the moment, worth more than most of the cargo manifest combined. You cannot spend a chest of coin on a night when you're thirsty in the middle of the Atlantic. You can absolutely drink someone else's fresh water. The escalating detail, what you actually found below decks, varied wildly depending on what kind of vessel you'd just taken. A merchant ship on a short coastal run might be carrying relatively fresh provisions, barely a few weeks old, practically gourmet by pirate standards. A vessel several months into its own long ocean crossing might have exactly the same tide. Weevil-riddled biscuit and suspect water your own ship was already carrying, which meant, on a bad day, you'd gone to considerable risk and effort to capture a ship whose food situation was no better than your own. There are documented instances across piracy's history of crews expressing genuine disappointment at a prize's contents. Less we found nothing of value, and more we found the exact same sad biscuit we already have. And then, sometimes, you found something genuinely unexpected, cargo nobody aboard your ship had ever actually encountered before, in forms nobody quite knew what to do with. According to an anecdote that circulates widely in popular pirate history, and it's worth flagging clearly that this specific version is disputed, more commonly attached to earlier Spanish and Dutch privateering encounters than to the classic Golden Age pirates themselves, and the exact details shift depending on who's retelling it, a raiding crew once captured a merchant vessel carrying a large cargo of cacao beans, the raw material for chocolate, and had no idea what they were looking at. Unfamiliar with the smell, the texture, or the value of dried cacao, and apparently unimpressed by beans that looked, to unfamiliar eyes, uncomfortably similar to dried animal droppings, the story goes that the raiders dumped or burned a significant portion of an extremely valuable cargo, only realizing its worth after the fact, if at all. Whether this happened exactly as described, happened to a different crew entirely, or has simply accumulated extra colour over 3 centuries of retelling, historians treat with appropriate caution. It's the kind of story that's almost too perfectly ironic not to spread, which is itself usually a small red flag for how reliably it's been preserved. But the underlying lesson holds up regardless of the specific anecdote's accuracy. Pirate crews weren't universal experts on every exotic good passing through Atlantic and Caribbean trade routes. They knew food, they knew drink, they knew coin and cloth and weapons, sugar, chocolate, spices, dye. These were relatively new, still unfamiliar luxury goods to plenty of ordinary sailors, and not every crew necessarily recognised what they were sitting on top of. Taking a prize's food stores wasn't as simple as loading everything useful onto your own ship and sailing off satisfied either. Space aboard a pirate vessel was finite, already crowded with your own remaining provisions, weapons, plunder, and roughly 100 or more men who needed somewhere to sleep. And this meant every barrel of someone else's biscuit or cask of someone else's water represented a genuine logistical decision, not an automatic yes. If your own stores were reasonably good, you might take only what was easiest to transfer and most immediately useful: fresh meat, drink, produce, while leaving heavier, bulkier goods behind. If your own stores were genuinely running low, the calculation shifted considerably, and crews would strip a captured vessel's hold close to bare, sometimes leaving the captured crew with barely enough to limp to the nearest port themselves. This is where an important, easily overlooked nuance comes in: pirate crews, as a matter of both practicality and reputation, often left captured crews with at least some minimal provisions, rather than stripping them completely and effectively condemning them to starve. Not out of pure sentiment necessarily, though there was likely some of that too, but because a reputation for leaving surrendered crews to die slowly of starvation was, from a purely strategic standpoint, bad for business. Remember the whole point of the flag: surrender quickly, and you'll probably survive with your life and some basic dignity intact. If word spread that pirates stripped every captured ship down to nothing regardless of surrender, that incentive collapsed entirely, and future targets might reasonably decide they had nothing to lose by fighting to the last man instead. Mercy, in other words, was partly just good long-term supply chain management. The escalating detail that makes this feel less cynical and a bit more human: several documented accounts from this era describe captured crews being treated with genuine, if pragmatic, decency fed alongside their captors during the boarding process, given the chance to collect personal effects, and in some cases even offered the option to join the pirate crew outright. An offer that, given the miserable conditions of most legitimate merchant and naval service at the time, a fair number of ordinary sailors apparently found tempting enough to accept. Let's talk about how captured food actually got divided once it was safely aboard, because this is where the written articles we discussed earlier, the ones establishing equal shares regardless of rank, did some of their most important, least glamorous work. On most naval and merchant vessels of the era, a captured prize's cargo, food included, would typically be distributed according to rank and position, with officers claiming the best of it and ordinary sailors receiving whatever was left, if anything specifically earmarked for them at all. Pirate ships, operating under the articles their crews had collectively agreed to before departure, generally didn't work this way. Captured food, like captured coin, was treated as common plunder, divided among the crew according to the shares laid out in the ship's articles. Shares that typically gave the captain and quartermaster a somewhat larger cut in recognition of responsibility and risk, but rarely the dramatically lopsided division common aboard naval vessels of the same era. This didn't mean every distribution went smoothly, or that resentment never crept in. Quarrels over division of plunder, food included, are well documented as a genuine source of tension aboard pirate crews, and the articles existed precisely because this kind of dispute was common enough to need clear, agreed-upon rules in advance rather than being negotiated fresh. And messily. Every single time. By evening, on a good day, flags struck without a fight, hold stocked with usable food, no serious injuries to speak of, the two crews might genuinely eat together before parting ways, captors and captives alike sharing whatever had just been redistributed, in a scene that reads almost like a strange temporary truce built entirely around a shared meal. Here's the mundane, comforting image: exhausted sailors from two different ships, sitting on the same deck, eating fresh bread and drinking wine that neither crew had touched in weeks, trading stories, trading rumours of other ships and other captains, briefly indistinguishable from each other in the simple, universal act of eating dinner. Here's the quieter subversion sitting underneath that image. This pleasant scene existed entirely at the pirate's discretion, and it could just as easily not have happened at all, depending on the captain, the crew, and a dozen other variables outside the captured sailor's control. We shouldn't romanticize this into something gentler than it actually was. But we also shouldn't discard the genuine, well-documented pattern of relatively humane treatment towards surrendered crews. Because it tells us something true and worth remembering. Piracy of this era operated according to its own internal logic and its own practical incentives, and outright, gratuitous cruelty toward a peacefully surrendered crew was, generally, bad practice rather than standard procedure, however much popular imagination since has assumed the opposite. It's worth closing this chapter with a genuinely different kind of prize story, one where the food itself, centuries later, became the discovery. In 1984, salvagers located the wreck of the Wider Galley, a ship originally built as a slave vessel before being captured in 1717 by the pirate Samuel Bellamy and lost soon after in a storm off Cape Cod. The wreck, recognised as the first authenticated pirate ship ever recovered, has since yielded thousands of artefacts, and among the coins, weapons and personal items. Archaeologists and conservators have also recovered galley equipment and provisioning-related material, the unglamorous, ordinary debris of a working ship's kitchen, preserved by 3 centuries underwater. It's a strange, quiet footnote to everything we've discussed tonight, the same battered cooking pots and storage containers that once held someone's weevil-riddled biscuit and rationed rum. Sitting today in careful conservation, studied not for treasure, but for exactly the kind of mundane daily detail this entire episode has been trying to bring back to life. Food and how it was captured, controlled and distributed tells you a great deal about a crew. It tells you even more about the man in charge of them, which brings us fittingly to the captains themselves, because how a pirate captain handled food and drink turns out to reveal more about his actual character than most of the sword fights ever do. History remembers pirate captains mostly for their battles, their flags and their ends, the cannon fire, the black sails, the gallows. It remembers them far less for the small, unglamorous policies they set regarding food and drink aboard their own ships, and that's a genuine loss. Because those policies, where the record preserves them, tell us something battles rarely do. Not what a captain was capable of in a crisis, but what kind of order he actually tried to build. Day after ordinary day, when nothing dramatic was happening at all. Tonight, let's look at a handful of these figures through exactly that lens, not the fights they're famous for, but the tables they kept, the rules they set about drink, and in a couple of cases, the almost accidental irony of how a meal factored into their own final chapters. Start with Bartholomew Roberts, sometimes called Black Bart, one of the most successful pirates of the entire Golden Age by sheer volume of ships taken. Estimates drawn from period accounts suggest several hundred vessels captured over his relatively brief career in the early 1720s, a genuinely staggering figure by any pirate standard. Roberts came to piracy almost by accident, according to the record a Welsh sailor serving as third mate aboard a slave ship captured by pirates in 1719, and reportedly reluctant to join his captors at first, before rising with remarkable speed to become captain of his own crew within a matter of weeks, following the death of the pirate captain who'd taken him. Here's the falsely comforting assumption a modern audience might bring to Roberts, successful pirate captain, presumably living the loud, indulgent life popular culture assigns to the role, heavy drinking, constant carousing, the works. Here's the genuine subversion, well documented in the period's most widely cited source on piracy. Captain Charles Johnson's account of the pirates of this era, Roberts, by multiple accounts, personally preferred tea to alcohol, kept a notably more disciplined table than most of his contemporaries, and imposed a set of written articles aboard his ship that read in places almost like a temperance pamphlet accidentally smuggled onto a pirate vessel. It's worth pausing on that source specifically. This widely cited General History of the Pirates, published in the 1720s, remains one of the most influential texts shaping how we understand many Golden Age pirates today, Roberts very much included, and historians have long debated how much of it represents careful reporting versus dramatic embellishment, particularly regarding quoted dialogue and precise details. So treat the specifics that follow with the appropriate grain of salt the source itself demands, while noting that the broad strokes are generally treated by historians as reasonably reliable. Roberts's articles, as recorded, reportedly included provisions requiring lights and candles to be extinguished by 8 in the evening, with any crew wishing to keep drinking past that hour required to do so up on the open deck rather than below, a rule seemingly designed less around morality and more around simple practical fire safety and discipline, given everything we've already established about open flame aboard a wooden ship packed with gunpowder. Gambling with cards or dice for money was reportedly banned outright, and the crew's drinking, while never eliminated, asking pirates of this era to abstain entirely from alcohol would have been asking the tide not to come in, was apparently subject to more structure and moderation than was typical of the period's reputation. The escalating detail that makes Roberts genuinely interesting rather than simply eccentric, this wasn't imposed as pure top-down authoritarian control, in the way a naval captain might have simply ordered discipline and expected obedience regardless of the crew's opinion. Pirate captains, remember, generally served at the pleasure of their crews, elected and removable by vote under the same articles that governed everything else aboard. Roberts's more disciplined table wasn't tyranny. It was apparently something the crew itself had agreed to, at least well enough to keep sailing under it through hundreds of captured vessels and several highly successful years, suggesting that whatever Roberts's personal habits, they weren't purely imposed against the crew's will, but broadly tolerated and perhaps even valued for the results they produced. Here's the dry, anachronistic joke this practically writes itself. Bartholomew Roberts was, by the standards of his own violent, chaotic profession, something close to the strict health-conscious manager who brings herbal tea to the office party and somehow still gets voted Employee of the Year, because everyone begrudgingly admits the results speak for themselves. Several hundred captured ships is a hard number to argue with, however much less fun the captain apparently was at a party. Contrast Roberts against Edward Teach, Blackbeard, probably the single most recognisable pirate name to survive into the present day, and a figure whose actual documented behaviour around food and drink sits in genuinely interesting tension with his own carefully cultivated, terrifying public image. Here's the setup most people already carry into this. Blackbeard, famous for weaving lit fuses into his beard before battle specifically to appear more demonic and frightening to anyone unlucky enough to be resisting him, presumably lived a life to match that theatrical menace. Here's the more complicated reality. Blackbeard's actual recorded actions suggest a genuinely shrewd operator who understood, better than almost anyone in his profession. That reputation alone could accomplish more than violence ever needed to. The clearest example connecting directly to food, and one of the best documented instances of his career, in May 1718, Blackbeard blockaded the harbour of Charleston, South Carolina, holding several captured ships and their passengers hostage, and demanding, according to the most widely cited accounts, a chest of medicine in exchange for their release rather than gold or coin, an unusual and specific demand that historians generally take as evidence of a genuinely pressing medical need aboard his own ships, possibly connected to disease among his crew. This wasn't specifically a food demand, but it sits in the same broader category, a pirate captain's practical, unglamorous priorities, laid bare by an actual crisis, revealing concerns considerably more mundane than the popular legend suggests. The escalating, more legendary detail, offered here with appropriate caution, popular accounts, retold across centuries with steadily accumulating colour, describe Blackbeard occasionally drinking a mixture of rum and gunpowder, sometimes with a splash of other spirits added, apparently as a display of toughness and theatre rather than routine refreshment. This specific detail is treated by most careful historians as folklore rather than solidly documented fact. The kind of story that fits Blackbeard's carefully built legend a little too perfectly to fully trust at face value, much like his fearsome beard full of lit fuses, which is itself documented but clearly understood, even at the time, as calculated performance rather than simple habit. Not every notable figure from this era commanded from behind a captain's table, and it's worth including, briefly, two figures whose relationship to food history is less about policy and more about the simple fact of their presence at all. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two of the small number of documented women who sailed and fought as pirates during this period, both eventually serving aboard the same ship under Captain John Calico Jack Rackham. There's no specific surviving record of either woman setting food policy the way Roberts did, and much of what's commonly repeated about their lives blends together documented court testimony with considerable later embellishment, so it's worth being especially careful here about what we can and can't confidently claim. What the historical record does support is this: both women lived under the same rationing, the same biscuit, the same rough shipboard diet as every other member of the crew, sharing meals and hardship alongside men who, per the ship's own articles, were bound to treat their portion no differently than anyone else's. The same equal share system we've discussed throughout tonight. Applied here without apparent exception. Their trial testimony, following capture in 1720, survives in reasonably solid documented form, and it's from records like these, court transcripts, depositions, official colonial correspondence, that historians reconstruct most of what we actually reliably know about ordinary shipboard life during this era, food included. Worth including as a contrast to all of this, not every captain in this world of piracy stayed a pirate. Woodes Rogers, an English privateering captain active in the earlier part of this same broad era, is best remembered today for commanding a long, difficult circumnavigation voyage in the early 1700s, and for later becoming the royally appointed governor of the Bahamas. Tasked specifically with clearing out the pirate havens that had flourished there, Rogers ran a notably tighter, more traditionally naval style of discipline around food and water rationing during his own long voyages than most pirate captains bothered with, a reflection of his position within the legitimate, rank-based structure of privateering and colonial service rather than the more consensual articles-based system pirates typically operated under. His career is a useful reminder that the line between privateer, pirate and colonial official was, throughout this era, considerably blurrier than the clean categories we like to sort historical figures into today, and that different food and drink philosophies aboard ship often tracked less with individual personality than with which side of that blurry line a captain happened to be standing on, at any given moment. And Roberts's story, fittingly, closes this chapter with one of the most genuinely poignant, ironic moments connecting food directly to a pirate captain's actual death, rather than legend. On the morning of February 10th, 1722, off the coast of what is now Gabon in West Africa, Roberts's ship was intercepted by Hunt Swallow, a British naval vessel that had been specifically hunting him for some time. According to the most widely cited accounts of that morning, Roberts was, at the moment the Swallow engaged, sitting down to breakfast, a final, ordinary, unremarkable meal, the kind he'd eaten hundreds of times before across a career defined by hundreds of captured ships. On a morning that gave no particular warning it would be his last. Here's the mundane setup that makes what follows land so hard. Breakfast, of all things. The same daily ritual we've spent this entire episode examining from every conceivable angle. The biscuit, the meat, the small comfort of a hot meal before the day's work began. And here's the subversion. Roberts was killed in the ensuing engagement, reportedly by grape shot, dying essentially where he sat, according to several accounts, still dressed in the fine clothing he was known for wearing even in battle. A captain whose entire career had been defined, in part, by unusually disciplined habits around food and drink, meeting his end over exactly the kind of ordinary meal those habits had shaped, on a morning that started like any other and ended with the most successful pirate of the entire Golden Age gone within minutes. The escalating detail that gives this its full weight, Roberts's crew. Following his death, and according to some accounts honouring what were understood to be his wishes, reportedly weighted his body and committed it to the sea rather than allowing it to be captured, identified, and displayed by the authorities who'd spent years hunting him, meaning that, unlike so many of his contemporaries, whose ends played out publicly on gallows as deliberate warnings to others, Roberts's actual death went, in its own way, quietly, privately, beneath the same ocean that had carried his ship to several hundred captured vessels across a career of only a few remarkably successful years. One more figure belongs in this lineup, if only briefly, tying back to the wreck we mentioned at the close of the last chapter, Samuel Bellamy, captain of the Wider Galley, whose brief but remarkably successful career ended in the same 1717 storm that eventually preserved his ship's galley equipment for salvagers to recover centuries later. Bellamy is remembered, among other things, for reportedly framing his own piracy in explicitly egalitarian terms, contrasting his crew's shared elected authority against what he characterised as the greed and hypocrisy of legitimate merchants and naval officers who lived comfortably while working sailors went hungry under their command. Whether his recorded words match his exact original phrasing is, per the same source caveats we've already discussed regarding this era's most colourful quotations, impossible to verify with certainty. But the underlying sentiment tracks precisely with everything this chapter has already shown in harder documentary form: shared articles, equal rations. A captain eating the same weevil-riddled biscuit as his crew. Bellamy didn't invent that system. He simply gave it, in his own reported words, its clearest stated philosophy, food and fairness, treated as two sides of the same argument for why this particular dangerous way of life was worth choosing at all. What ties all of these figures together? Roberts's tea and strict articles, Blackbeard's calculated theatre and quieter medical concerns, Bonny and Reed's shared biscuit ration, Woodes Rogers's stricter naval-style discipline on the other side of the law entirely, isn't a single unified lesson about pirate captains generally. It's the simple recurring reminder that the food and drink policies these men and women lived under, set, or endured reveal something battles and legends usually paper over, that even history's most notorious figures spent the overwhelming majority of their time not fighting, not raiding, not making dramatic last stands, but simply managing the same unglamorous daily question every crew in this episode has faced tonight. What do we eat? How much is left? Who decides how it's shared? The specific answers varied captain to captain, crew to crew, voyage to voyage. But the question itself, patient and constant beneath every legend we tell about this era, never really changed at all. And it's that question, quiet, practical, endlessly repeated across 100,000 ordinary mornings at sea, that actually decided who lived long enough to become a legend in the first place, far more often than any cutlass ever did. There was one place, though, where this question got answered on a scale no single captain's articles could manage alone. An entire town built almost entirely around solving it. Let's go there next. You've made port at New Providence, in the Bahamas, sometime in the 1710s, and if the previous months have trained you to expect a resupply stop as a brief. Business-like errand, refill the water, grab what fresh food the local trade allows, get back to sea within a few days, then Nassau is going to recalibrate your expectations considerably. This isn't a quick errand. This is closer to a small, semi-permanent town, built loosely around the harbour, run by an informal and constantly shifting alliance of pirate captains, and functioning, for a brief window of years, as something historians have taken to calling the Pirate Republic, a real, if chaotic and short-lived self-governed pirate settlement, with its own rough economy, its own social order, and its own answer to the exact food problem this entire episode has been circling all night. Here's the mundane setup. You're expecting the usual dockside chaos, barrels, sacks, shouted numbers, and you get that, certainly, but layered on top of an entire settlement's worth of taverns, market stalls, and semi-permanent residents. Many of them pirates between voyages, some of them simply local traders and opportunists who'd figured out that provisioning several hundred hungry sailors at a time was a genuinely profitable business. Law or no law. Nassau, during these years, operated with essentially no functioning royal governor willing or able to enforce English law, which meant the settlement ran, in practice, on whatever informal rules its pirate population and local traders worked out among themselves. The subversion worth sitting with, this wasn't lawless chaos in the cartoonish sense. It was, in its own rough way, a functioning food economy built specifically to serve exactly the population passing through it. Provisioning became one of the town's genuine industries, alongside the more obvious business of fencing captured goods. Local traders and small-scale farmers on New Providence and nearby islands grew produce, raised livestock, and caught fish specifically to sell to arriving pirate crews, who arrived, predictably, with money to spend and an urgent practical need for exactly what those traders were selling. It's not so different, structurally, from any small port town that's ever built its economy around servicing sailors passing through. The goods and the customers just happen to be somewhat more colourful than usual. Walking the market stalls near the harbour, you'd find fresh produce brought in from small local plantations and gardens, citrus fruit among it, which, remember, nobody yet understood was doing anything more than simply tasting good, but which was nonetheless keeping a fair number of these crews healthier than their counterparts on longer, less port-dependent naval voyages. You'd find fresh-caught fish, sold straight off small boats that had gone out that same morning. You'd find livestock, chickens, pigs, sometimes cattle, either slaughtered fresh for immediate sale or sold live, for a crew to load aboard and slowly work through across their next voyage, exactly the way we discussed back at the very start of tonight's journey. Prices in this market ran considerably higher than they would have in an established colonial port, and this makes a certain grim sense once you think it through. Sellers knew exactly who they were dealing with, knew that crews were often flush with recently captured coin and had nowhere better to spend it, and priced accordingly. A returning crew might grumble about paying handsomely for fresh meat and produce that would have cost a fraction as much back in a proper English or Spanish port, but the alternative was simply doing without, and after months of weevils and stagnant water, very few sailors were inclined to haggle hard over the cost of a natural orange. And you'd find rum. an enormous, almost comically disproportionate amount of rum. Because Nassau's economy, like the shipboard economy we've spent all night examining, ran substantially on alcohol, both as the preferred drink of a population largely made up of off-duty sailors, and as one of the most valuable, most easily traded commodities passing through the harbour at any given time. Taverns did a booming trade, serving crews flush with recently captured coin and eager to spend it on exactly the kind of fresh, unrationed drink that months at sea had made them appreciate considerably more than they might have back on land. Here's the escalating detail that gives Nassau its particular flavour, so to speak, because the settlement drew crews from dozens of different ships. Operating under dozens of different captains and dozens of slightly different sets of articles, it also became a genuine hub for trading food preservation knowledge itself. A crew that had recently plundered a Spanish vessel loaded with unfamiliar Caribbean produce might trade tips on preparing it with a crew more experienced in exactly that kind of foraging. Buccaneer-descended sailors, carrying the smoking and curing techniques we discussed earlier, mixed freely here with crews from entirely different backgrounds and traditions, and Nassau's taverns functioned, in a very real if completely undocumented way, as an informal clearinghouse for exactly the kind of practical food knowledge that kept a crew alive 6 months later. Somewhere else entirely. The dry joke available here, and it's a fairly gentle one Nassau was, in its own chaotic 17th and early 18th century way, something like a trade convention for the food logistics side of piracy, if you stripped out the branded lanyards and replaced them with cutlasses and an alarming amount of rum. Nobody was calling it that at the time, obviously, but functionally, that's more or less what was happening every time two crews swapped notes over a tavern table about which islands had the best turtle nesting grounds this season. Several of the era's most recognisable names passed through this exact market at one point or another, and it's worth naming a few, because it grounds the whole scene in something more concrete than a generic tavern sketch. Benjamin Hornigold, one of the settlement's earlier and more influential figures, is credited in several accounts with helping establish Nassau's informal governing structure in the first place, and reportedly took a hand in mentoring younger captains passing through. Blackbeard himself apparently among them in his earlier career, before Teach struck out on his own with a larger, more independent operation. Charles Vane, a considerably more volatile figure by most accounts, also used Nassau as a base during this period, and his eventual refusal to accept Woodes Rogers's pardon, reportedly sailing out of the harbour in open defiance, flags flying, rather than surrender his ship, is often cited as one of the more dramatic moments marking the settlement's final unravelling. None of these captains, so far as the surviving record shows, left behind detailed personal notes on grocery shopping. But their presence in the town, well documented through later trial records, colonial correspondence, and the same general history that gives us so much of what we know about Roberts and Blackbeard, confirms that Nassau wasn't some vague, generic pirate haven existing only in later legend. It was a real, specific, mapped location, with a real market, real taverns, and a real, if short-lived, economy. One that these specific named historical figures actually walked through, haggled in, and drank in, between voyages, in between all the more dramatic events that made their names famous in the first place. Living in Nassau for any real stretch of time, even a few weeks between voyages, meant adjusting to a rhythm that was neither fully shipboard nor fully land-based, something in between, shaped entirely by the settlement's total dependence on exactly the kind of trade and provisioning we've been discussing. Housing was rough, often little more than simple huts or tents near the shore, and disputes over food, drink and money were common enough that the settlement's various pirate captains occasionally had to informally mediate between their own crews and the local trading population, in the absence of any actual governing authority to do it for them. This wasn't a lawless free-for-all in every sense of the word. Reputation, reciprocal trade relationships, and simple self-interest in keeping the supply lines open did a fair amount of the work that formal law might have done elsewhere. It's worth pausing here to note something genuinely important about why a settlement like Nassau could exist at all, and it circles back to something we touched on earlier in tonight's journey, the accidental health advantage of a port-dependent lifestyle. Crews that spent real time in a place like Nassau, with regular access to fresh produce, fresh meat, and clean water, weren't just enjoying themselves. They were almost certainly staving off exactly the kind of nutritional decline that plagued longer, less port-dependent naval voyages. Nassau's rough tavern economy, in other words, may have been quietly protecting its population from scurvy considerably more effectively than any formal naval medical policy of the era, purely as an accidental side effect of a settlement built to feed hungry sailors cheaply and often. Of course, this arrangement couldn't last, and it's worth telling honestly how it ended, because the ending connects directly back to a name we've already spent time with tonight. By 1718, the English crown had grown sufficiently alarmed by Nassau's role as an open, thriving pirate haven, disrupting shipping, undermining colonial trade, and generally embarrassing an empire that liked to think of itself as controlling these waters, that it dispatched Woodes Rogers, the same disciplined former privateer and captain we discussed a little earlier tonight, to serve as the Bahamas' first royal governor and, quite explicitly, to shut the whole operation down. Rogers arrived with a royal pardon on offer for any pirate willing to give up the trade voluntarily, alongside a clear, credible threat of naval force for anyone who refused. The response split the settlement roughly down the middle. A significant number of pirates, tired of the constant risk and drawn by the genuine offer of a clean legal slate, accepted the pardon and settled into more ordinary lives. Others refused outright, scattering to continue raiding from other bases, some of them, according to various accounts, going down fighting rather than accept what they viewed as a surrender of everything they'd built. Within a relatively short span of time, Nassau's brief window as a genuinely self-governed pirate settlement closed, and it became, under Rogers's administration, a more conventional English colonial port, still a working harbour, still dependent on trade and provisioning, but no longer the loosely lawless food and rum economy it had briefly been. There's a certain quiet irony worth sitting with as this chapter closes, and it's one that ties directly back to everything we've discussed about food and provisioning tonight. The same practical, logistics-minded discipline that made Woodes Rogers a notably strict rationer of food and water on his own long voyages was, in a very real sense, exactly the quality the Crown needed in the man sent to dismantle Nassau's freewheeling supply economy. A career built on tight, careful management of ship stores turned out to be excellent preparation for shutting down a town whose entire identity had been built on the opposite: abundance, easy trade, and remarkably little oversight. History doesn't often hand you such a clean thematic bookend, but this one's genuinely there in the record if you go looking for it. And so, by the time you leave Nassau, pardoned and settled, or slipped away before Rogers' ships arrived, or simply passing through on your way to some other harbour entirely, you carry with you a version of provisioning that no single ship's hold could ever quite replicate: the accumulated, traded, informally shared food knowledge of an entire community of hungry sailors, worked out over years of trial and error in taverns and market stalls, before the whole loosely organised system quietly folded back into the ordinary machinery of empire. It's a fitting place to leave this particular thread of the story, actually not aboard a ship at all, but ashore, in a rough, temporary, remarkably human settlement built entirely around solving, communally and imperfectly, the same question every single chapter tonight has circled back to: what do we eat? How much is left? Who decides how it's shared? Nassau answered that question for a few short years with about as much collective ingenuity as this era ever managed. And then, like so much else in this story, it simply ran out of time. And that, in the end, is what 6 months at sea actually tasted like. Not the romance of adventure, at the slow, patient arithmetic of survival, worked out in barrels of biscuit, salted meat, and water that turned against you long before the voyage did, and on the better days, in someone else's fresh bread, someone else's good rum, shared out fairly under rules the crew had written for themselves. Whether that crew was arguing over portions in month 4 or sitting down, one final ordinary morning, to breakfast. It's easy from this distance to laugh at the weevils, to wince at the water, to feel a small, safe thrill of relief that none of us will ever need to tap our dinner against a table before eating it. That relief is fair. It's earned. You should feel it, but underneath the dark comedy of it all sits something quietly remarkable, ordinary people, doing extraordinary things with almost nothing, building small systems of fairness around a shared bowl of stew, finding humour in their own hardship because the alternative was simply breaking under it, and treating even a stranger's surrender, and a stranger's galley, with more decency than legend usually gives them credit for. Whether commanding a strict tea-drinking captain's ship, or sharing a mess with 2 women fighting under the same rough rules as everyone else, the sailors in this story kept finding small human ways to make an impossible situation survivable. So tonight, as you drift off, let that be the thought that follows you down, however uncomfortable your bed feels, however far away sleep seems, you are, by every measure that would have mattered to a hungry sailor in 1720, remarkably enormously fortunate. No weevils tonight. No rationing. No captain deciding whether your surrender earns you dinner or nothing at all. No tally to check. No barrel to tap against the table before you trust what's inside it. Just rest, waiting for you, exactly where you left it. Sleep well.